I see everyone joining in right now. Welcome everyone on Zoom, on Facebook, on YouTube. Welcome. We are so happy to have you today as we discuss another important subject. Today's topic, Abdu'l-Bahá, Exemplar and Educator. So today's speaker, Dr. Barbara Johnson, PhD, is in the field of global education. She served as co-administrator. Of Llewellyn Baha'i School and director of the National Children's Education and Research Center. When that center was based at Llewellyn from 1991 to 2008. Dr. Johnson served as founding director for the Teacher Education Program of Colorado Mountain College from 2008 to 2018, and she currently serves as lead editor for Tender Branches Press, a division of Loving All the World, Inc., a not-for-profit organization created to engage children, families, and communities with resources and initiatives to promote justice, peace, unity, and service. So today's topic, again, to describe Abdu'l-Bahá, Exemplar and Educator. This presentation features Abdu'l-Bahā's actions to empower children, youth, and adults to be the people we want to be, building a world of peace, justice, and unity for generations to come. It includes stories from our new book, Loving All the World, written by talented authors and illustrated by gifted artists to illustrate his courage and love from earliest childhood. Abdu'l-Bahā's example shows how he raised up courageous lovers of humanity and teachers of peace in both the East and the West, and lays the foundation for our own loving, courageous actions in our homes, neighborhoods, and of course, the world. With that being said, thank you, Dr. Barbara Johnson, for joining us today. And thank you all on Facebook and YouTube. Please, as you are looking at your screen, we want to remind you that your comments, we'll see them. If you post your questions there, we'll see them. Also, for those of you on Zoom in the chat, please don't hesitate to ask your questions here in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom and we will get to you. We really appreciate your patience. With that being said, thank you, Barbara, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's beautiful. I see some faces. John, where are you? It looks like you're outdoors. Is that right?
I have a background. This is
the magic scenery.
Yeah, this is a construction of a bridge in Tampa Bay that's going on.
Okay, so we all need bridges.
Okay. Yes, we do.
Excellent. All right. Well, friends, looking at names here, I see Stephen Collins from North Carolina, where I am at present. Are the others mostly local in Clearwater area or roundabout?
Local and roundabout, I'd say.
Well, dear friends, I'm going to go ahead and get started with PowerPoint. So most of our time together, I will be sharing slides. So as John mentioned, it will be great if you interrupt me because the whole point is you. Okay, so here we go. Let's see. Okay, friends, can you see this slide? Can you see the slide, somebody?
Yes, we see.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So all this says is that here we are and we are together. And the topic, of course, is Abdu'l-Bahá. So it will be interesting to see what he does and what we can do. So, of course, John mentioned our new book, Loving All the World, Stories to Inspire. So the point actually is to inspire our own action. Abdu'l-Bahá is our perfect exemplar, and we are striving to follow. So, as I mentioned, we'll be sharing some stories that introduce Abdu'l-Bahá. Some of us know him very well, probably better than I do, so that will be great. We'll remind ourselves briefly of some of Baha'u'llah's teachings. So Abdu'l-Bahá, of course, we know is the son of Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah is the founder of the Baha'i faith, and Abdu'l-Bahá is his son. And he was the head of the faith after Baha'u'llah's passing. So he imbibed his teachings and translated them into action from a very young age. Okay. So he educated in the East, he educated in the West. He raised up educators in the East. By East, I mean primarily the Middle East, or West Asia, as it's sometimes called, and in the West. And for today, I'll be talking about the United States and Europe a little. And then what are we doing ourselves to follow the example of Abdu'l-Bahá? So that will be another time together. So introducing Abdu'l-Bahá. Some of us know these stories very well. This is a painting by Luthando Mazebuco for a story about Fridays in Akka. So Abdu'l-Bahá is actually rather famous for his deeds. He said that his name is Abdu'l-Bahá, which means servant of Bahá, or servant of Baha'u'llah, or servant of glory, and that he says servitude is his perpetual religion. So that's what we'll be focusing on today, this path of service. And of course, we know that in Akka, he lived many years as an exile, as a prisoner, sometimes imprisoned closely in prison barracks, sometimes on house arrest. But the people came to love him. The jailers loved him. The ordinary people loved him. And there were extremes, of course, of power and disempowerment, intentional. There were extreme poverty with no noticeable social services to make a difference, and sometimes no way to earn a livelihood. So Abdu'l-Bahá, like his parents before him, took that personally. This was his field of action. So I want to go back and show you this. So you can see the white painted building. That's the house where Abdu'l-Bahá lived for a time, still as a prisoner. It has now been painted and beautified. And this is the rest of Akka in Israel, where people lived. And Abdu'l-Bahá, although he was a prisoner, managed every winter to make sure everyone, hundreds of people, had warm cloaks or coats. He made sure that if someone was sick, he would visit them, he would give them medicine, he would hire doctors for them. He took them as his personal care. And on Fridays, the people from the community of Akka would gather in the street outside his house. Some of the Baha'i friends, other Baha'is, would be there with Abdu'l-Bahá, and they would help the people get organized into a line. Abdu'l-Bahá would greet each one individually. So the visiting the sick was regular, the warm coats in the winter was regular, and these Friday gatherings were every week. And so Abdu'l-Bahá would greet each person. He would give them money if they needed it. He would send them to get work if he knew someone was able-bodied and there was a job they could get. And at the end of the day, at the end of this gathering, he would not forget the children. So if there was a babe in arms, he would greet the child. If there was a young child, he would encourage them. And before saying goodbye, he would he gave the parents some coins, but in the end, he would toss some coins in the air and the children would scramble for them to their delight, becoming a game. So that is one way that hundreds and hundreds of people knew Abdu'l-Bahá, and that is how he gained the love, one of the ways that he gained the love of the authorities. So how did Abdu'l-Bahá get there? Being servitude to the human race as his perpetual religion, a shelter for all mankind, a shield unto all who are in heaven and earth. How did that happen? So Abdu'l-Bahá was born into a home of privilege. This is a artist's rendition of a garden that his parents had 10,000 poplars trees, thousands upon thousands of roses. So his parents, although born into wealth and privilege and had a life of nobility in the court of Iran, they didn't go to parties. They gave their wealth away. But sometimes the children had a special occasion. So in the summertime, this is a picture of a summer garden. They would visit the cooler mountain air above Tehran, where they were living, and sleep sometimes on the top of this garden pavilion. Of course, we don't know exactly what their pavilion looked like, but this is the type of pavilion that was in Iran at that time, in a garden. And in the morning, Abdu'l-Bahá and his sister and his little brother were served tea by their dad, their father, Baha'u'llah. So those are some of the happy memories that he started out with. However, his parents became Babis, followers of the Bab, who were sharing a new message from God. And Baha'u'llah, the father of Abdu'l-Bahá, was a very prominent and active Babi. He rescued a famous woman, Tahirih, and when Abdu'l-Bahá was only 4, he remembers being held on the lap of Tahirih, and that she actually, when she was listening one day to some of the other Babis talking about the great revelation, the message of the Bab, she was tired of listening to all this talk. And she said, the day of service, of action is come. Let deeds, not words, be our adorning. So Abdu'l-Bahá remembered that his whole life, and no doubt that inspired his actions. So what happened next? As a follower of the Bab, excuse me, I think I lost a slide there. All right. As a follower of the Bab, Baha'u'llah was exiled, imprisoned. And before that, I have to tell this story. This is Abdu'l-Bahá and the important message. So when he was 7, still living a life of privilege, he was asked by his father to carry a message to a general of the army. So he went with a family friend, a household servant. They rode 30 miles on fast horses to deliver this message to the general. The general said, "Why don't you stay the night here in the army camp?" Well, the servant said, this is not a safe place for a kid because of the political intrigues of the time. So he encouraged him. He pretended there was a hamlet with flowers right around the corner. "Oh, come on, Abdu'l-Bahá, let's go. So Abdu'l-Bahá kept listening for this important, beautiful hamlet where they might stop. This was in the middle of winter, but they kept riding. So it was a round trip of 60 miles that day. Abdu'l-Bahá was very cold. He warmed up at home. He was carried in. He was almost asleep, this little boy, when he got home. But he was very happy because he had been successful in delivering this message. Okay, so now we come to the banishment. So, of course, as a follower of the Bab, Baha'u'llah was placed in a terrible dungeon and then exiled. The family went with them. So from January until April was travel from the city of Tehran to the city of Baghdad. Abdu'l-Bahá became very, very cold. He rode a horse, sometimes with the adults. Sometimes he was carried by a friend of the family. And I imagine sometimes he rode in a conveyance on the back of a donkey with his mother and sister. This was a very harsh journey in the middle of winter. And finally, in April, they arrived in Baghdad. So Abdu'l-Bahá later said, "In Baghdad, I was a child. There and then he announced to me the word, and I believed in him." So Abdu'l-Bahá, when Baha'u'llah was taken out of prison, immediately recognized that some wonderful change had come across his father. How does that translate into action? Well, we've heard the story of Abdu'l-Bahá as an adult providing warm clothing for the people of Akka. That happened even when he was a child. So when he was in these Baghdad years, when Abdu'l-Bahá was still quite young, remembering those cold winter journeys over the mountains, someone one day gave him a new abba or cloak, a warm cloak, and he put it on in Baghdad. He went walking. He was walking in a palm grove, walking in a park. And then he noticed some people from the desert, some men, a group of men started following him. And Abdu'l-Bahá could see that they loved his new warm abba, his new cloak. And it troubled him, this young person, young Abdu'l-Bahá. He thought, what should I do? Well, as he thought about their longing for his cloak, he decided that he would take it off and give it to them. So he did. The men became very happy. When Abdu'l-Bahá got back to his family, they said, what happened to your new cloak? He said, oh, I could see that these men wanted it. And so I gave it to them. He said, they became very happy and I became at peace. I became happy too. So you can see this generosity starts at the earliest stage. Okay. So we won't go into this long history of exiles and travels and hardships of Baha'u'llah and his whole family, which Abdu'l-Bahá experienced at every stage of his life. But I do want to call our hearts to some of the principles that Abdu'l-Bahá experienced, lived, grew up with, the holy words of Baha'u'llah that shaped his whole life. So let's look at some of those. So of course, Baha'u'llah said, regard the world as the human body. We're all connected. If my finger on my hand hurts, well, that affects my whole body. And the same it is with our beautiful gardens. If some fungus starts to grow, well, that damages everything. And the same in the body of humanity, that if there's injury somewhere, it affects all of us. Baha'u'llah wrote, he who is your Lord, the all-merciful, cherish it in his heart, the desire of beholding the entire human race as one soul in one body. So that's the transition that humanity is making right now, from seeing ourselves as separate, imagining that I can be healthy if you're sick, that realizing the fact that we're as connected as the plants and animals and earth and sky and water in a garden. We are one soul and one body. Baha'u'llah also wrote, regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value. Education can alone cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom. This is a picture of a mine in North Carolina, one of the mines. And then drawing on the teachings of the Bab, who wrote, the newly born babe of that day excels the wisest and most venerable men of this time. Okay. So we have a lot to do. And let's see. Tells us that the greatest means for the advancement of the world of being and uplift of souls is the education of children. And that is why so many of us have dedicated our lives to the education of children. Baha'u'llah explains that which must come first is to teach them the oneness of God and the laws of God. So this principle of oneness is the foundation of everything. It's our pivotal principle, of course. The hearts of all children are in the utmost purity. And continuing that same quotation, the hearts of all children are in the utmost purity. They're mirrors, they are mirrors upon which no dust has fallen. But this purity is on account of weakness and innocence, not on account of any strength and testing. For as this is the early period of their childhood, their hearts and minds are unsullied by the world. Okay, so you can see then Abdu'l-Bahá explains that the teacher and his system of teaching plays the most important role. Okay. So Abdu'l-Bahá, now as an adult in Akka, did pay attention to the ages and stages of children. Famously, he wrote to his grandson, Shoghi Effendi, who saw Abdu'l-Bahá writing. There were Baha'is all over the world by then. And Abdu'l-Bahá was the center of correspondence. He was the person that kindled their hearts and kept them active, kept them happy. And so Shoghi Effendi said, Abdu'l-Bahá, write something for me, write a tablet for me. And what Abdu'l-Bahá wrote was, now is not the time for you to read and write. It's the time for jumping about and chanting, oh my God, therefore memorize the prayers of the blessed beauty and chant them that I may hear them, because there's no time for anything else. So noting that the child is not the same as the adult. And of course, in response, little Shoghi Effendi did memorize the prayers. He did chant them. He chanted them so loudly and so constantly, running around the house, up and down the stairs, here and there, everywhere, chanting at the top of his lungs. His parents finally said to Abdu'l-Bahá, please tell him to be quiet. But Abdu'l-Bahá said, no, let him alone. But Abdu'l-Bahá would also have remembered that a teenager, is not the same as a young child. He would remember that when his sister was a teenager in Baghdad, a young teen, she was trusted by Baha'u'llah to carry out missions that no girl of her age could or would be willing to perform, and that she seized her opportunity with joy. So noticing the differences from early childhood to middle childhood to youth and into adulthood. So that would be part of Abdu'l-Bahā's wisdom. And the focus, be a teacher of love in a school of unity. Instruct God's children in the customs of the kingdom. So Abdu'l-Bahá did just that. He provided for the moral and spiritual education of the children, but also their practical education. So the Baha'i children, the children of exiles, learned a trade. Each one learned some practical means of earning the livelihood, but they also learned the arts and the sciences. So Dr. Yunus Khan was Abdu'l-Bahā's translator to and from English. One day, Abdu'l-Bahá showed up at Dr. Khan's desk and said, now it's time for you to organize English classes for the children. He had Mishkan Galam, the famous calligrapher, teaching the children calligraphy. He had other Baha'i scholars teaching them history. So it was a complete education, arts, sciences, practical, and spiritual education. An example of the sciences, Shoghi Effendi, now just a little older, not much, when he was visiting Beirut, so Akka is on the Mediterranean, south of Beirut, going north a little bit into Lebanon. There was a Syrian Protestant college where some of the Baha'is were studying to be physicians. Zia Baghdadi was one of them, and Shoghi Effendi, as a young child, spent his time there looking in Dr. Baghdadi's medical book, but he wasn't satisfied with the books. He wanted to dissect an animal. He wanted to see, how do these parts fit together? How does this work? And so a wildcat was provided, which was killed and dissected. in front of Shoghi Effendi. So this would have been part of the medical education, not an extra murder of an animal, but part of the education. Shoghi Effendi watched with care, with silence, with attention. And later on, he was able to recite it practically word for word. How is this beautiful creation made? How does the physical body work? So we've got arts, we've got sciences, we've got trades, we've got spiritual education. And Abdu'l-Bahá himself attended to the children's education. So I mentioned earlier the Friday mornings when the citizens, the poor, the people in poverty in Akka would come for money, come for clothing, come for love, come for encouragement. But Abdu'l-Bahá wasn't then finished. He would wash his hands because people would have even scratched him accidentally or hurt him in some ways. He cleans up. He turns to the Baha'i children. So there would have been 22, 23, 25 kids resident there in the Holy Land. And it was time for them. So they would already be lined up. They would from the tallest to the shortest, the youngest to the oldest. And he would talk with them in a very loving way. He would ask them to show him their work. So the children would put their work in front. They would have a pen at hand, sharpened and ready to go. And Abdu'l-Bahá would give instruction. He would say, oh, this letter should be written a little higher. This straight lines need to be straighter. Here's a curve that needs to be shaped in that way. And he would take the pen and he would correct their papers. And sometimes he would say, oh, your work is perfect or beautiful or whoa, your handwriting has gotten worse. He was even quoted as saying. When he got to the younger children, he would still inspect their work. He would ask them questions in a funny way and make them laugh. He would inspect their hands to make sure they were clean. Public health, a prevention of infection. He would pay attention to all of the details of their lessons. And then he would move on to a general discussion of manners, of conduct, of good living, of the nature of religion, of God. And the adults would come closer and closer and closer and closer because they wanted to hear too. But then finally, as the talk was coming to an end, Abdu'l-Bahá would once again get out his money bag and he would give the children coins. So the older ones would get a little more than the younger ones, or if the family was more prosperous, they'd get a little less. And so that was the end of the Friday morning with the children. And then Abdu'l-Bahá would go inside and attend to his other duties of serving the local officials or writing tablets or his extensive correspondence. So again, Abdu'l-Bahá, the educator, he arranges for the education of children. He raises up educators for children. He finds the best possible educators for children, and he involves himself. Okay. Now, if we're turning our attention to after he was finally free to travel, after most of his life as a prisoner and an exile, he traveled first to Africa, Egypt, then some places in Europe, and then to North America. This is a photo when he was in Chicago, Lincoln Park, with the children. He noticed, some of you may have observed, I've not called attention to any of your shortcomings. So Abdu'l-Bahá was encouraging a very positive environment for learning. That applies to us too. Okay. So I notice everyone is on silent. You're not calling attention to my shortcomings. Thank you. Appreciate it. Once again, calling attention again to the children. Every child is potentially the light of the world. This is Abdu'l-Bahá on the sidewalk on its way to Riverside Park in New York. You can see how he's dressed. He's dressed in the way of people where he was living in Israel. So he has baggy trousers, he has a long robe, and he has a cloak. He has, I don't know if you can see it because of the Zoom stuff at the top of the screen, but he has a small cap, felt cap, wrapped with a white cloth. So a taj, maybe sometimes called, and sometimes people have said it was a small turban wrapped around. But you can see this is how Abdu'l-Bahá was dressed when he was in the United States. So on this day in Riverside Park, the Baha'is, although Abdu'l-Bahá never wanted someone to celebrate his birthday, they had arranged for a birthday party. They had kept it a secret. They knew that Abdu'l-Bahā's recreation, his only time of peace was to take a walk in the park. But they went to this park. Juliet Thompson was there. This is recorded in her diary, that they had a birthday cake. They had a sponge cake. It was very, very sweet. It was the best cake they could figure out how to make. It was loaded with icing, absolutely gorgeous, and it was a secret. But as Abdu'l-Bahá entered the park, he was ahead of the other Baha'is, and some of the children started to notice that he wasn't dressed like they were. He was not dressed like the other people they saw in New York City. He was wearing clothes like people from Asia, Western Asia, or the Middle East, depending on what people say. So they started making fun. They started telling little jokes. They started talking with each other. They started laughing. Some of them even started to pull on his clothes. And the Baha'is, I'm sure you can imagine, were very upset. They said, "Oh, master, we have to change this. We have to send those boys away." What did Abdu'l-Bahá do? He said, "Bring me the cake." They hadn't told him they had a cake. He said, "Oh, master, it's your cake." He said, "Bring me the cake." They brought him the cake. He said, "Bring me a knife." They gave him a knife. So then he started counting the kids. 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know exactly how many there were, but he counted each one. And then he took the knife. The children had stopped making fun. They had stopped pulling on his clothes. They were silent. They were watching Abdu'l-Bahá as he counted them. And then he took the knife and he cut the cake into exactly that number of pieces. He handed a piece to each child. Each one got a piece of cake. That was the whole cake. It was gone. So Abdu'l-Bahá knew how to make the kids happy. So everyone was happy that day. The Baha'is were pretty surprised, but they saw how Abdu'l-Bahá celebrated his birthday. His generosity doesn't just extend to lessons or coins or coats, but also to birthday cake. Okay. Abdu'l-Bahá explained again and again and again, among the greatest of all services that can possibly be rendered by man to Almighty God is the education and training of children. He says it's very difficult to undertake this service, even harder to succeed in it. So of course, that's where we all are. We're facing a difficult assignment. And let's see what he says though. According to what we have heard, you're succeeding in this. You must, however, struggle unceasingly to perfect yourselves and win ever higher achievements. So one person now in Washington, D.C., that took his advice quite to heart was Pauline Hannon. She and her husband are famous because they taught, among other things, Louis Gregory, the Baha'i faith. Louis Gregory is a very famous Baha'i. Pauline Hannon was raised in the southern city, the deeply segregated city of Wilmington, North Carolina, here on the coast in North Carolina. In, what year was it? In 1889, there was a very famous insurrection. So remember, this is after the Civil War, Reconstruction. So there was a multiracial government elected in Wilmington. And there was a mob of 2,000 white men that burned and pillaged the African-American homes, murdered, it's unknown, at least 60 and maybe more than 300, forced thousands to leave their homes. They went into the woods and eventually left the area. They overthrew the elected government. And this led the way for white supremacy laws throughout the South. So Pauline Hannon was raised there. And she said that she grew up being afraid of Black people, but she became a Baha'i. Abdu'l-Bahá had sent a famous scholar, Mirza Abul Faz, to Washington, D.C. in 1901 to teach the people about this principle of oneness, that all of these new teachings from God, which will help us build the world we want to live in. So she was going to these classes and she became a Baha'i. And interestingly enough, she's famous as the mother of Baha'i children's classes. She started in 1907 integrated children's classes. She wrote dozens of letters to other Baha'is who also wanted to start children's classes. She said that her integrated children's classes were no problem. She would send her son to escort the African-American children. Her son was white, so that they would have no harassment coming to her home for Baha'i classes. But how did she change? How did she get from this little girl who was raised in such a horrible environment to someone who was championing the principle of oneness? She said it was the words of Baha'u'llah. She said that they sunk deeply into her heart. And that one day, as she was preparing for the US holiday of Thanksgiving, she was out shopping. It was snowing, it was icy, and she noticed a Black woman also out shopping. Her arms were full of purchases for Thanksgiving dinner, and she noticed the woman's shoes were untied. So Mrs. Hannon knelt in the snow and tied the other lady's shoe. And she said at that moment, she had a deep realization of the principle of oneness. And that is why she dedicated her life to that principle and to raising children who would live that principle. Now, why do I mention this? I mention it because of a very famous child, well, a child who grew up to be a very famous woman who visited. She lived in Philadelphia, but Marian Anderson, who Arturo Toscanini said, a voice like hers comes around once every 100 years. She was famous as the voice of the century. She sang on the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. later to tens of thousands of people. Anyway, this is Marian Anderson with her mother. Marian Anderson is front setter with her two sisters and her mother. She grew up in Philadelphia. Her family, like many others, faced poverty. Her father was killed in an accident at work. Her mother did laundry and cleaning to support the family. But her voice was so beautiful that she was already singing in choirs. She would sometimes sing for organizations and get maybe a quarter. Well, she was visiting in Washington, D.C. one day, and she visited when Abdu'l-Bahá was there in 1912. And I think it was Joseph, the son of Pauline Hannon, had purchased some cat's eye pearls. Now, some of you have seen a marble that has a different color on the inside that's shaped like a cat's eye. That's a cat's eye marble. A cat's eye pearl is an agate. That's a semi-precious stone that has that same iridescent light reflecting capability in the shape of an eye. So it's called a cat's eye pearl. And Abdu'l-Bahá gave one of those to each child that was present that day. And he saw Marian and said to her, "You will become a great singer someday." She took that stone home. She gave it to her mother. She asked her mother to keep it for her. And she, when she went on her European tours, she took it with her. She later visited Pauline Hannon years later and said that whenever she was sad or discouraged, she would take out her cat's eye. It would give her strength and courage, would give her comfort and hope. And that's how she sustained herself through all of her travels. In the 1960s, a horticulturalist developed a rose, a beautiful red rose. it was named after her, the Marian Anderson Rose. And in 1965, the National Spiritual Assembly purchased a dozen Marian Anderson roses and planted them in the gardens of the House of Worship. Marian Anderson visited and spoke there that day. She was very happy, and she even told Pauline Hannon that she considered herself a Baha'i, although she never registered as a Baha'i. So this is a photo from Baha'i News in July 1965 with Marian Anderson there. So again, the power of children to hold the truth in their hearts and dedicate their lives to it is cultivated by Abdu'l-Bahá and by the teachers he raises up. So it's not just kids Abdu'l-Bahá wanted to teach, it's the adults too. This is a story from Denver. So Josephine Clark was a fourth grade teacher, and she was so excited that Abdu'l-Bahá was coming to visit her town. He had even promised to come to her house for tea. She cleaned her house. Everything was perfect, but she didn't have time to do the dishes. She was a professional woman. She had to go teach her classes. So she left the dishes in the sink. So when it was time after school, she rushed to the train station to be part of the group meeting Abdu'l-Bahá. When she got there, there was no one there. She thought, oh, I had the wrong day. She went home, and Abdu'l-Bahá and his companions were standing on her porch. So, okay, no problem. She invited them to her living room, which was perfect. She had dusted it. She had cleaned it. It was sparkling. She was ready to serve tea. And Abdu'l-Bahá said, oh, just a minute. I'll get myself a glass of water first. So he went into the kitchen, of course, helped himself to the water, saw this mess of dishes. And she said, when he came back to the living room, he just sat and laughed and laughed and laughed. And Mrs. Clark said that she learned a lesson that day. She said she had always thought herself slightly better than some of the others because she could do all these things. But she thought what she learned was, oh, can't hide anything from Abdu'l-Bahá. And oh, we all have faults and weaknesses striving on the same path. So through laughter, Abdu'l-Bahá taught that lesson. Now, on his return back to the Holy Land, he stopped in Paris, and he provided a lesson for the adults in Paris as well. He asked the adults to meet him on the edge of a city. I don't know exactly which neighborhood, but it was just right at the city limits. And they walked together. They were thinking, now, why does he want us here? Because it was, again, a very poor neighborhood, shabby homes, people, out their windows shouting at each other. She could say some people were drinking alcohol. And the Baha'is were getting more and more worried. Abdu'l-Bahá was walking with them. They finally came to a particular gate, and that they saw a Baha'i they knew, and so they went in, and it was there that a couple, the Poincenels, Mr. and Mrs. Poincenel, Madame and Monsieur Poincenel, were having a Baha'i children's class. They had, I think, about 15 kids from babies through youth, and Abdu'l-Bahá said, "This is a beautiful meeting. I've been to many homes, many wealthy places, and this is the most beautiful of all." He gave the Poincenels some money to support their work, and the Baha'is realized that that is why he invited them to go with them that day. Not to be afraid, but to love, because the children were so responsive. Even the older ones that had been a little rowdy, they calmed down. They wanted to be close to Abdu'l-Bahá. They responded to his love. Okay. So again, this is a photo of the Master in the Holy Land. The kids are eating candy that he had given them. He said, take the utmost care to give them high ideals and goals, so they will cast their beams like brilliant candles on the world. Heroes are they, lead them to the field of battle. Guides are they, make them speak out with arguments and proofs. Ministering servants are they, cause them to pass round the cup that brimmeth with the wine of certitude. So this is our future, these beautiful children. They must show the results of their study in their deportment and deeds. Otherwise, they have wasted their lives. Okay. So Abdu'l-Bahá, the educator of educators, he sent Dr. Susan Moody to Iran, and she was going to provide medical care for women and girls, but also became the principal of the Tarbiyat School for girls. So that school was very famous for its excellent educational methods. We discussed those a little earlier, and that they didn't hit the kids. No corporal punishment. That was unusual in that time and place. Dr. Amin Banani has told a story about that. He was saying that so this is now after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, that he was a student in the Tarbiyat School for boys. And when Mr. Furatan became the principal, the kids were all lined up to greet their new principal. And then the boys' school caught up to the girls' school by eliminating corporal punishment. The boys had been actually beaten with the bastinado until then. And Mr. Furatan was well trained and changed that rule. He said the kids loved it. Okay, so let me tell you another little anecdote. This is a photo of Dr. Iraj Ayman. I don't know if some of you know him. He's now in his 90s, I think 96. So Dr. Ayman, or Iraj, was a little boy growing up in this environment in Iran. He attended deepening classes, study classes on the Baha'i faith with his mother, taught by Janabi Fazl Mazandarani, who's a very famous Baha'i scholar. So in that, he learned the history of the faith. Okay. He learned the history of the faith and the principles of the faith. He was particularly interested in some answered questions and also the history. Some answered questions talks about what's the reality of a human being, how do we grow and develop, so on and so on. He also went with his parents to attend committee meetings. This is in the city of Tehran in Iran. His parents were on a committee that had been appointed now by Shoghi Effendi in the 1930s to identify historic sites that would need to be known in future for Baha'i history. He said that he used to sit outside the window while they were having their meetings. And one of the committees, as I said, Shoghi Effendi wanted them to identify and mark, locate, and document historic sites. So one of the places they had a hard time finding, they couldn't find, was the burial site of Badi. Badi is a young man who delivered a message from Baha'u'llah to the Shah of Iran, and then he was killed. But no one could find his burial site. They knew in general where it was, but they wanted to mark this particular location. So Hirash told me that he loved coming to Baha'i meetings, and that he and one of his other friends, a little boy, wanted to come early to the feast. So it was an outdoor feast, just a Baha'i meeting for devotions and consultation and fellowship. And he said that after the two little boys, himself and his friend, arrived, the next person to arrive, well, the next two people were old men. So I don't know how old you have to be to look old to a 10-year-old. But anyway, the next arrivals were very old, according to Iraj. And they were living in a kind of a retirement complex in Tehran. And they said that they shared their space with retired executioners. So they apparently each had a room or a place, and some retired executioners were in the same complex. They were talking to each other, and while the little boys were listening, and saying that they were telling the story of a young man that they had been assigned to kill years earlier. And that they said no matter what they did to him, he was peaceful. He wouldn't talk. He observed silence. And the chief executioner would come around and say, do this stuff more, do that more, do this, do that. Nothing had an effect. And so finally the chief executioner said, well, kill him. So they killed him. And they were worried about burying him because, according to a superstitious idea they had, they thought, whoa, this guy is so strong. He's not going to stay buried. He's going to come after us. So the chief executioner looked around and saw this huge white boulder and said, well, bury him and then put that big rock on top. He'll stay buried. So the executioners were talking about that. And little Iraj went to his parents and said, oh, I heard this story. So then the adults consulted and decided that they would go visit this retirement complex and talk to the retired executioners and see what they could learn. So while they were there, they were looking around, looking around, and Iraj was looking around. He saw this big white stone and he said, maybe that one. So they talked with the executioners and said, yes, that's the stone, that's the burial site. So in this way, a child, remember, heroes are they? Lead them to the field of battle. So this is an example of one child being hero. So he was using the environment. He was transcending his circumstance. And then he later went on to become a professor of education. He was a continental counselor in Western Asia and then Eastern Asia before the revolution, after the revolution, lives in Chicago today. So that's one example of what a kid can do. So it wasn't just the few that were educated. This is a photo, I don't know if you can see the year, Tarbiyat classes for girls in 1933. The government ordered the Baha'i schools closed in 1934, but the weekly classes continued. The Baha'i classes continued. So the academic courses were required to be closed by order of the government, but the Baha'i classes continued. And they continued all the way into the present. Here's a photo from 1977. Even in the remotest village areas of Iran, the kids were learning. And some of us well remember the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1970, in the late 1970s, 78, 79. And I want to share with you some examples of heroic children. This is from a letter written by Mrs. Zinus Mahmoudi in June 1981. So the first story I want to tell you about is Sammy. Sammy was 5 years old. He was preparing himself in kindergarten to be going to grade 1. He was a very advanced student. He was well behaved, quick to learn. He could memorize and recite eloquently. So when the inspector came around to his school, the teacher picked him to showcase. And finally, after several other demonstrations of little Sammy's sweetness and knowledge and skill, she asked him to recite a poem that began with the sentence, "I am a Muslim child." So Sammy observed silence. The teacher repeated the instruction. Sammy remains silent. And because he had always been so excellent in his work, the teacher said, "Well, why don't you recite this?" And Sammy said, "Because I am not a Muslim, I'm a Baha'i." So the inspector left the room. The teacher was in trouble, complained to the headmister, called the mother in, warned Sammy not to teach the faith at school, told him not to talk this way. But Sammy replied to his mom, "I'm a Baha'i. Will always tell people I'm a Baha'i. If they bother me, I'll go to the police station and complain." So Mrs. Mahmoudi concludes that report saying, "Poor little one. He was yet to learn that for him there is no police station." Another example, Ilahi, age 8. She was the daughter of one of the men who was killed for being a Baha'i in 1980. And after he was killed, she took sweets and to school and flowers for her teacher. And the teacher said, "Is this a Baha'i custom to give gifts when one's father is killed?" And the little girl said, no, my father was not killed. He was martyred. One more example. This is Akram, an 11-year-old girl. Again, her father was killed. And at the end of the summer, killed simply for being a Baha'i, she was asked to, like all the other children, to write an essay on what did they do over the summer. So she wrote a very sweet story talking about how the Revolutionary Guards had come to their home, had taken away her father, kept him in prison for a while, that she had actually seen him in prison, and then he had been killed. And she said that Mrs. Mahmoudi wrote that her essay was so moving that it brought tears to the eyes of the children, even the teacher. But the teacher was angry, became angry, took the essay to the principal, and the principal told Akram, well, your essay deserves the highest marks, but because it mentions the word Baha'i, you need to withdraw it. So Akram wrote a new essay. So again, the heroic courage of the children. And then Mrs. Mahmoudi herself was executed later that same year. It's not just the Baha'i children that can become heroes. This is a photo of Ruby Bridges, who's famous as one of the children who became part of the school integration movement in the United States. It was law in the United States that the schools for Black children and white children could not be separated. But she was in New Orleans, and the white families were boycotting the school rather than have it integrated. So Ruby was going to be the only child, 5 years old, 6 actually, who was going to be in school. She had to be escorted to school by federal marshals. This is in the 60s, following the legal requirement of integrated schools. And people spat at this child. They shook their hands at her. They spat at her. They called her names every day, day after day after day. But Ruby, she would, escorted by the federal marshals, would go to school. When she reached the school, she would turn around, she would smile at the mob, and then she would go in. So Robert Coles is a psychiatrist, actually. He interviewed Ruby one day, and he said that he had heard from the teacher that she was praying for the mob, the people in the mob. And Ruby said, oh yes, I do pray for them. These are Ruby's words. They keep coming and saying the bad words, but my mama says they'll get tired after a while and they'll stop coming. They'll stay home. The minister came to our house and he said the same thing, not to worry. And I don't. The minister said, God is watching and he won't forget because he never does. The minister said, if I forgive the people and smile at them and pray for them, God will keep an eye on everything and he'll be our protection. So that is a heroic child. And it wasn't just the Black youth rising to heroism. A 14-year-old boy from a very working class, almost impoverished home responded in an interesting way. He was saying that in his school, so there were white kids at the school, there were 2 African-American youth who were integrating that school. And he said he didn't want them. Nobody did. People were calling them names. He said that but this Black youth, the Black youth that he was watching, were displaying such good character. They were polite. They were doing their work. They never caused trouble. And he said one day he saw people picking on one of these youth. And he surprised himself by going over and saying, cut it out. That wasn't how he had been raised, but he said that he couldn't help it. And then he turned to the Black youth and said, I'm sorry. And his friend said, what are you doing? What are you doing? The white youth later said, it was one of the strangest moments of my life. But there I was, and I saw him being so good that something in me just drew the line and something in me began to change. So we can all change. We can all become stronger. One more example. This is again from the civil rights era in the United States. This is Audrey, age 9, 1963. In Birmingham, of course, in the segregated US, Black people were not allowed to shop in certain stores. The schools were still separate and so on. 4,000 children walked out of school to march for their freedom. They were met with police dogs, fire hoses. They were hauled off to jail. This little girl was facing across the table 5 white men who said, "Who forced you to march?" She later said, "I wondered if they were going to kill me, but I said, nobody forced me." The white guy said, "Are you sure?" Audrey replied, "Yes, sir, I decided myself. I want my freedom." So I think that we do not need these life and death situations to show heroism. I think that our children every day, our teachers every day can do this as well. We hope in less challenging circumstances, but with the same moral courage, the same love for all the world. How can we follow Abdu'l-Bahá's example? Well, number one, commit to this principle, our pivotal principle, unity and diversity, the principle of oneness, but we're not all the same. We can learn from his example. That's why I wanted to tell you some stories this morning. We can learn about children and their communities so that we operate with an accurate perception of reality. We can practice. We can think about what works. We can try again. We can persevere and be happy. So again, this pivotal principle rests on the foundation of justice. The best beloved of all things in my sight, Baha'u'llah says, is justice. Abdu'l-Bahá explains the injury of one shall be considered the injury of all, the comfort of each, the comfort of all, the honor of one, the honor of all. We can learn to see the children. Baha'u'llah once explained, using a metaphor, he was talking about stones. He was saying that if we look at stones or glass or anything else, we see the color. We see yellow or red or white. And if we focus on those differences, conflict can appear. But if we look at the light that reveals all this beauty, then we can see our oneness. So again, diversity matters, and we're all one. That education is the foundation of all human excellence. We can encourage the children to build friendships across barriers. And we want this message of love to become so well known that it's famous. The children from all levels of society will want the divine teachings as well as secular knowledge. From people who can strive to live this message. So, of course, the Universal House of Justice is the ultimate authority in the Baha'i faith, and they reaffirm what Abdu'l-Bahá has told us again and again, that the spiritual education of children and junior youth are of paramount importance. The children are the most precious treasure a community can possess because in them is the promise and guarantee of the future. They have given us community building actions, collaboration of individuals, institutions, and communities, classes, as we've already discussed, raising up. This is a photo from when I was living in Colorado. What was important there was to raise up teachers because the majority of the children where I lived spoke Spanish in their homes. And so it was critical to identify potential teachers who were bilingual and from the same community to become teachers. So this was a graduation party to train teachers from their same background. and how wonderful it will be when teachers everywhere are familiar with these teachings and imbue the children with the fragrances of God. So you can see that these actions start with us, expand to our family or a small teaching team, include reaching out to our immediate neighbors, even in COVID, expanding to the community, to the broader region, and ultimately the world. So it's up to us. We get to make the same choices as Elahi or Sami or Ruby. I wanted to conclude by giving you some of my personal heroes who, to my eye, exemplify some of these teachings. You may remember Dr. Daniel Jordan. He focused on the spiritual reality of the child, the entire child. So from nutrition to academic learning to moral education. Created a whole system. His papers are actually at Stanford, so I'm sure they'll be built on in the future. Dr. Alberta Dees established the first preschool for African-American children in, let's see, let me look this up, in Alabama. She had the first preschool for African-American kids in Alabama. She's a Baha'i teacher, committed deeply to the principle of oneness. And in her home in December 31st, 1969, there were 19 people who declared their faith in Baha'u'llah. And within a week, there were more than 10,000. There were dozens and dozens, so that there were more than 10,000 new Baha'is in South Carolina in 1970. Pretty impressive. She was the first administrator of the Louis Gregory Baha'i Institute, served on the National Spiritual Assembly for many years, ultimately pioneered to the Navajo Nation, where she served as a professor at Diné College. Two of my heroes. Patricia Locke, she of course is Lakota, passed away. She is famous. She won a MacArthur Genius Grant for her work with Indigenous communities. She was instrumental in founding 17 Indian colleges on reservations, among many other things. Ray Johnson, currently living in Arizona. He was headmaster at New Era Baha'i School in India for a dozen years. Then he was the principal of the Maxwell International Baha'i School in British Columbia. When he was in New Era Baha'i School as principal, he and his wife and their family, that was when the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran. He went to Iran shortly after the revolution to pick up 2 or 3 children that were coming to be residential students at New Era Baha'i School in India. When he was at the airport, there were 90 children parents wanted him to take. He took them all. He took them home. His wife, Lynella, says that they lived on rice that whole year because they just absorbed the children into the dormitories and really became their parents for the next dozen years. So those children all stay in touch with Dr. Johnson and Lynella Johnson, Ray and Lynella. So anyway, some of my heroes. Another, I missed one. I have to go back. I want to show you Joni. Joni, you're a dear friend of mine. She was an educator, speech pathologist, and audiologist, lived in California, dedicated her summers to full-time Baha'i service. And you can see the next picture is of Joni with lots of kids around her. Upon their faces may be seen the brightness of the light of the All-Merciful. Children upon children upon children arising to do great deeds. And the result of all of this will be paradise, when all humanity is gathered together under the tent of unity in the kingdom of glory. So one more thing to share with you. I know we have a few minutes left. I mentioned that the stories that I told are from our new book. It's called Loving All the World. Some of these stories will be in English for the first time. It's written at about the upper elementary grades reading level. So check it out. We had a Kickstarter campaign to pay for the printing of the book. That campaign is still open, but the goal is met. However, there are still a few books that can be ordered. If you do, I think you will like it. There are 20 artists, a dozen authors. I think you'll like it. So here's the web address. Okay. www.lovingalltheworld.org. Book cover. This was painted by a friend of ours in Colorado. He's not a Baha'i, but I explained to him about the project, and then all of the people were contributing their service, the authors and the artists and so on. I told him some of these stories about Abdu'l-Bahá, and he said, I know what I'll paint. So he invited some family friends. It's a family of 14 children, some adopted. It's a multiracial family. He invited the kids to come play in the park, and he painted them. This is the park across the street from his house. I've been there many times, and you can see the kids having a good time. So again, it's not just about heroism, it's also about joy. All right, friends, that's all of me. Time for your comments, questions. What would you like to say or ask? I haven't been paying attention to the chat. I wonder, are there?
That was a beautiful presentation. I enjoyed every story that you shared with us. Thank you.
Yeah, Robert, it's kind of hard to hear you. If you you get a better connection, it's hard to hear you. But we understand that you were very grateful for the stories I hear, right?
Thanks, Robert.
Well, we have.
Are there questions in the chat, John? I haven't opened it.
We have a question from Clearwater. The question is, if you know about the Tarbiyat school, about this part of the history, why did the government close the academic classes and yet allow Baha'i classes to continue? Why did they close down the Tarbiyat schools?
The education system in Iran, now they were closed in 1934. So there were, I think I skipped a slide. Let me zoom back to it and see if I can find it. Let's see. Sorry, thank you for your patience here, but I think it'll help because it has some numbers on it. Besides, you get to see the faces of these kids again. All right, there we are. So you can see that from the beginning, Abdu'l-Bahá was encouraging not just the children in the Holy Land that he knew personally, but everywhere. In Egypt, there were Baha'i classes. In India, there were Baha'i schools, academic schools with Baha'i classes mixed together. In Iran, now look at this bottom bullet. By 1918, still when Abdu'l-Bahá was alive, 10% of all children in any school in Iran were going to Baha'i schools. There were schools in villages, villages in towns, schools in cities. It was huge. That they were excellent for moral and spiritual training, the dedication of the teachers and the students, very high standards. The kids would go for their exams, and the kids from the government schools, most of them would fail. The kids from the Baha'i schools, almost all of them would succeed. They used modern methods of education, science-based education, laboratory sciences, gymnastics, training for teachers. Everyone was welcome. The Shah himself sent children from his family to the Tarbiyat school in Tehran. So you can see 24,000 primary students, 2,392 secondary students, and those are the ones that are listed. Everyone was welcome. There was a Persian American Educational Society that was responsible for raising funds. So it was a collaboration of East and West for the education. Again, teachers, Lillian Knapp, Susan Moody came from the United States and served in those schools. They are not the only ones. Okay, so the question was, why did the schools close? The schools closed because Shohi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, the head of the faith in 1934, after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, had instructed Baha'i institutions to observe the Baha'i holy days, the days that are held sacred because of historic events such as the declaration of the Bab, or the birth of Baha'u'llah, or the Rezvan celebration. So all of those are to be observed by Baha'is. And so, and then there are schools run by Christians, schools run by Zoroastrians, schools run by Jewish communities, and they celebrated their holy days. So there were state days when the schools were to be closed by order of the government, and those were the Muslim holy days, but also some government holy days. But then these other religious schools also closed on their designated holy days. The Guardian told, Shoghi Effendi told, remember this little boy chanting? He told the Baha'is to observe the Baha'i holy days and close the schools on the stop work days. And so they did. And so because that was in not accepted holidays by the government, the schools were ordered closed. So the Baha'i schools continue, the Baha'i classes only on Friday, which was a non-school day, continued simply because they weren't government regulated. So there was more or less oppression, more or less, fewer or larger numbers of murders. The persecution ebbs and, gets higher, gets lower. But that's why I wanted to make a point of the Baha'i classes continuing after the academic schools had to close. Did that answer your question?
I think it did for the person who asked it. If you want to get further clarification, please unmute yourself. Appreciate it. And in addition to that question, Regina is asking that we post a website for the book again, the website for the book.
Yeah, it's, maybe I can put it in the chat here.
Cool.
And John, while she's doing that, I just want to tell you, I loved your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I have a profound affection for early childhood educators because of their whole makeup and inclusion, their patience, their emphasis on learning is so innovative. But thank you for answering the question about Marian Anderson. It was relegated to Baha'i hearsay until it was affirmed by you. So thank you so much.
There is a story about the cat's eye pearls is in this book. And our source is the biography of the Hannon and Knobloch families.
Thank you.
And so it has been reviewed by the U.S. National Spiritual Assembly's review office. Entirely authentic.
Thank you.
Anything else I can do for you? I can take you if you want to this. Someone asked about this book if I stop this share and would you like to see where you just go to that website for a minute? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, that could help. Yeah. You shared as well. And for those of you who can't see the Zoom chat, it's www.lovingalltheworld.org.
Okay, so I will stop this share and see if I can manage to get to this next one. Let's see. Yeah. I think I just got myself out of the thing. I just undid myself, I think. Can you help me?
What is it that you need help with?
I lost my whole Zoom thing.
So you can go to the share screen icon on the bottom, and then you select share your entire screen to share the website, or you could share your website directly by looking at the application only, which you're displaying the website on. But in addition to that, so this book and the images we saw, that comes from the one book that we were talking about, or are there others?
Absolutely, that's all from this this new book.
Beautiful. So these subjects we discussed today, some of them are in this book, like
All of
the stories
yeah,
of Abdu'l-Bahá.
all of the stories from Abdu'l-Bahá. Okay, can you see the screen now?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
However, why is this year so special, 2021? Why is it so special?
Well, of course, Abdu'l-Bahá is the center of the covenant, the head of the faith for his lifetime after the death of his father. And he lived until 1921. So this is the 100th anniversary of his passing. And the book was made in tribute to them. So it's a gift of all the authors, all the artists. We do have to sell it because it costs money to print it, but it's really intended as a gift to the children of the world. So can you see this website now?
Just go ahead.
Not yet. It just says you started screen sharing. There we go. Now we see it. All right. Lovingalltheworld.org. 27 stories about Abdu'l-Bahá, 176 pages, 150 full color illustrations. Beautiful, beautiful.
I think that didn't work.
Well, we saw the website for a moment, I think, right?
Okay, so you can find it.
Yes, yes. So thank you very much, Regina, for that excellent question. And for all of you who just saw it, if you go to that website and you see that image, you'll probably be in the right place.
Okay.
So what are Baha'is doing around the world for this commemoration of the ascension of Abdu'l-Bahá, his passing?
Well, there are many, many things, and they're happening all over the world, as you said, John. So one of the things is that a shrine is nearing completion to serve as a beautiful garden and burial site for Abdu'l-Bahá. So he, of course, has been buried in a very lovely place within the shrine of the Bab in the Holy Land, and now he will have his own shrine. But everyone there are great deeds everywhere. And I would say in the United States, championing the principle of oneness, that racial unity is still, the need for racial unity is still our most critical and challenging issue. And that is why we need to do this work. Okay, so I think I see a question.
Yes, Alex Boyson asked a question. He asked, based on your experience, how do you feel Baha'i communities in the Western world might promote the education of children in an effective way beyond or through children's classes for spiritual education?
Well, I think as you saw, the words of Baha'u'llah, that before all else, teach them the oneness of God and the laws of God. So spiritual education is the foundation. It's the beginning, but it's not the end. It's the root of the tree, not the tree. And so I can say that, again, you remember the story about Iraj Ayman, the little boy that helped find the burial site of Badi, this famous Baha'i hero. He ultimately, before the revolution, he was on the local spiritual assembly in Tehran. Maybe someone on this Zoom knows him. But he said that they would send visitors. There were Baha'i educators assigned to every neighborhood, and they would visit the Baha'i classes. They would make sure that the classes were of excellent quality, and that they would also check up on the academic progress of the children. And that if the kids needed tutoring, that would be arranged so that the Baha'i kids excelled. And so I think that one of the steps would be, I think that we're working on it, our neighborhood children's classes, but then adding, not stopping with a simple lesson and one story and one quotation, but also becoming real friends with the families, paying attention to them, talking with them about the academic preparation of their kids, and so on and so on. So being a true friend, a true member of the same community, and working together. And I see Shamaim is saying that the shrine looks like it's going to be finished in 2023.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Much appreciated. And Alex says, thank you so much. Wonderful advice. So we have discussed quite a few subjects today, and definitely this presentation you've made today, a lot of people have enjoyed it who are here on a Zoom. They're giving you their thanks. And we thank you in Clearwater. We thank you, Barbara, for this beautiful presentation. This is, as Dr. Dean pointed out, Robert Dean here, he tried to give you his congratulatory statements, but the connection kind of had an issue. We definitely think this is an excellent fireside subject. And for those of us watching, perhaps we could use this as a fireside subject for other instances, and maybe even invite you to discuss those items further beyond the presentation we have recorded today. So we really thank you so much for taking the time to be so thoughtful and really keen on detail. This presentation really has struck a chord with a lot of people here, and we thank you for that.
Okay. Well, thank you. My pleasure entirely.
So with that being said, everyone, we wish you a beautiful Sunday. It is about 12:30 now, and this is September 19, 2021. A very holy year for us Baha'is as we commemorate the centenary of the ascension of Abdu'l-Bahá. We recommend you do some research online, learn more about this very, very great, mysterious figure in Baha'i history, as we call him the exemplar of the Baha'i teachings. Allah help everyone, and good afternoon.